Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and it's good to see you all here today. So, this weekend is special in a way. It's a weekend of remembrance, December 7th and December 8th. Today, December 7th, in the US, Pearl Harbor Day, and December 8th for Mahayana Buddhists everywhere, Rohatsu, called Rohatsu in Japan. Rohatsu being a celebration of the Buddha's awakening. So I would like to relate two stories today. One, the story of Pearl Harbor, and the other, a story of the Buddha's awakening. In a way, a dark story and a light story. So I don't know if your history lessons were like mine in school, but I was taught that Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor, was an unprovoked act of aggression by Japan against the United States. And that was largely the message. But there is a backstory. So I would like to tell a story that uh, I'm sure leaves out a lot, but gives some context. So in 1854, Admiral Perry visited Tokyo Bay, accompanied by a few battleships, to negotiate a favorable trade agreement with Japan. Now, this was a time in Japan when the shogunate, which had ruled Japan for centuries, was weak and the imperial court was in power. It was a time in the world when there was rampant colonization throughout the world in search of various resources and possessions. The emperor of Japan at the time, during what is called the Meiji Restoration or the Meiji Revolution, could see what was happening around the world and felt that countries were either becoming predators or prey. And given that choice, the emperor chose to be a predator, which involved rapid modernization, industrialization, and militarization of Japan, which had been a largely self-sufficient agrarian society until that time. So with remarkable speed, those things were accomplished, and Japan became the dominant military power in Asia. Well, there was a weakness that was perceived, and that is that it, being an island nation with relatively few natural resources to draw upon, and in particular, having no native access to oil, very little iron, and no rubber, which were the ingredients for industrialization and militarization. The emperor made plans to colonize, like the other powerful nations were doing, and they annexed Korea, moved into Manchuria, had eyes on particularly Indonesia because of the rich oil resources available there, and viewed that as an alternative to what they perceived a unsuccessful or unacceptable situation of importing the vast majority of their oil from the United States. Well, as it turned out, the United States, having annexed the Philippines, also had their eyes on the same areas, Southeast Asia and Indonesia, the West Indies, as it was called. So the two nations seemed to be on a collision course. And Japan, deciding to sort of take the offensive, thought that they could eliminate the threat of the U.S. Pacific Fleet by attacking Pearl Harbor. And that would free them to engage in their colonial interests without interference from the U.S. So they planned this attack very carefully. And from a military standpoint, executed it quite well. It occurred on December 7th, the US date. Actually, in Japan, it was already December 8th because they're on the other side of the international timeline. So that act, the attack on Pearl Harbor, initiated a series of events that led to millions of deaths and the utter destruction of the Japanese economy. Now, the fact that it occurred on December 8th in Japan was probably a coincidence. There were strategic reasons why they wanted to proceed just on that day, and not religious reasons. But December 8th, which in Japanese is Rohatsu, the 8th day of the 12th month, is a time of celebration of the Buddha's awakening in the Zen tradition. So I would like to also tell the story of the Buddha's awakening. Now, all stories are, in some measure, fiction. What are stories but a recollection, sometimes faulty, sometimes embellished, of events that occurred in the past that are highly selective, leaving out usually over 99% of all that occurred, and selecting particular aspects to move the story along. So the story of the Buddha's awakening, I'm sure, is like that, as is the story of Pearl Harbor. But in brief, the story of the Buddha's awakening goes something like this. At least this is one version. He had been, at 29 years of age, moved to seek something more profound than his life in the palace. And for 6 years, engaged in the life of a spiritual seeker. And during the latter part of those years, he engaged in severe ascetic practices, mortification of the flesh, which culminated at one point in him being by the roadside, sitting under a tree, totally emaciated and dangerously near death from starvation. He was seen by a young woman, Sugata, who took pity on him and went to the house and got some kheer, which is like rice pudding, milk, rice, sugar, cardamom, and brought it to him for nourishment. And receiving this, he regained a little bit of strength. Enough strength that he continued his spiritual seeking, but in a special way. He recalled a time when he was under a rose apple tree as a young boy. And he was sitting there quietly and felt this tremendous peace, this tremendous wholeness. He remembered that moment and determined that he would sit under a ficus tree until he had accomplished his quest, achieved what we now call awakening. During the time that he was sitting there, still in meditation, Maya, the tempter, appeared and tried in various ways to distract the Buddha. And on one occasion, he appeared with a number of soldiers and said, "These are my witnesses. These are my witnesses, Gautama." Who is witnessing for you? And the Buddha placed his right hand on the earth and said, "The earth is my witness." In some versions, it's the earth goddess is my witness. In other words, being grounded in reality. So finally, one night, the Buddha looked up, gazing at the morning star. We call this Venus. At the time in ancient India, it was called Shukra, which is named after a Hindu god. And the meaning of the name is clear or bright. And he attained at that time the realization that he was looking for. So, of course, initially, he, having realized this and being satisfied with it in himself, had no idea how he could possibly communicate this to other people because it wasn't really a verbal realization. discursive realization. It was just an overwhelming, transcendent realization. So how am I going to describe this? So he initially thought he would not be able to, but then came up with the resolve to try to teach others what he had realized in various ways. So I thought, in remembrance of Rohatsu, I would read sections of the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. This is a telling of the Buddha's first teaching after his realization. And he was talking to his companions, the ascetic seekers who had been with him during his search. And they were skeptical. They thought he had just sort of given up by starting to take nourishment. So he had to convince them in some way of what he had realized. I'll read sections from Tanisaro's translation of this Pali text. I have heard that on one occasion, the Blessed One was staying at Varanasi in the game refuge of Isipatana. There he addressed the group of 5 monks, his companions. There are these 2 extremes that are not to be indulged in by one who has gone forth. Which 2? That which is devoted to sensual pleasure, with reference to sensual objects, base, vulgar, common, ignoble, unprofitable, and that which is devoted to self-affliction, painful, ignoble, unprofitable. Avoiding both these extremes, the middle way, realized by the Tathagata, producing vision, producing knowledge, leads to calm, to direct knowledge, to self-awakening, to unbinding. And what is the middle way realized by the Tathagata? That producing vision, producing knowledge, leading to calm, to direct knowledge, to self-awakening, to unbinding? Precisely this noble eightfold path: right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Right can be translated also as skillful, or wholesome, or beneficial. Leading to calm, to direct knowledge, to self-awakening, to unbinding, to freedom. Now, this, monks, is the noble truth of stress. Birth is stressful, aging is stressful, death is stressful. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair are stressful. Association with the unbeloved is stressful. Separation from the loved is stressful. Not getting what is wanted, stressful. In short, the 5 clinging aggregates are stressful. Form, feeling, perception, formation, consciousness, that are clung to despite their being transient. And this, monks, is the noble truth of the origin of stress, the craving that makes for further becoming, accompanied by passion and delight, relishing now, here, and there, craving for sensual pleasure, craving for becoming, wanting to be something other than what you are, and craving for non-becoming, wanting to be different from what you are. And this, monks, is the noble truth of the cessation of stress, the remainderless fading and cessation, renunciation, relinquishment, release, and letting go of that very craving. And this, monks, is the noble truth of the way of practice leading to the cessation of stress, precisely the noble eightfold path. And monks, as long as my vision was not pure, I did not claim to have directly awakened to the right self-awakening unexcelled in the cosmos with its deities, Maras and Brahmas, with its contemplatives and Brahmins, its royalty and common folk. But as my vision was truly pure, then I did claim to have directly awakened to the right self-awakening unexcelled in the cosmos with its deities, Maras and Brahmins, with its contemplatives and Brahmins, its royalty and common folk. Knowledge and vision arose in me. Unprovoked is my release. This is the last birth. There is now no further becoming. That is what the Blessed One said. Gratified, the group of 5 monks, delighted at his words, and while this explanation was being given, there arose to Venerable Kondanya the dustless, stainless Dharma eye. Whatever is subject to arising is also subject to ceasing. So, 2 stories. One, a dark story, and one, a light story, a story of enlightening, where the Buddha, trying his best to understand the nature of things, to understand his place in the universe, drove himself near death, but was saved by an act of compassion by Sujata, and went on, having received the strength from his nourishment, to realize what he was seeking. So both of these stories are familiar, either in detail, in particular circumstances you may be familiar with them, or at least archetypally they are familiar. The stories of conquest, both of them in a way are stories of conquest. One, conquest of nations, and the other, conquest of the self. So what do these stories bring to mind to you? And how do we find light in the darkness? I think I'll stop there, and we'll go into breakout rooms, and then we'll return in a few moments. Thank you very much for listening on this Rohatsu weekend.